Everyone. My name is Kelly LeGrand Wiener, and I'm the managing attorney at Scott Legal. And we are going to spend some time today talking about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low and risky cases. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that this firm was founded on an E-2 visa about 10 years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US personally on an E-2 visa and has renewed the visa twice. The firm is a full-service immigration firm, but focuses primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, meaning kind of lower investment amounts. We've processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will continue our webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. And at the end of this webinar, we're going to send you a few things. So one is the PowerPoint that you'll see today. Another is the E-2 Visa Comprehensive Guide. And the third is a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. For our panelists today, we are very lucky to have Michaela Vrazdova, who's an associate at Scott Legal and has vast experience processing E-2 visas. I will also be speaking. As I mentioned, my name is Kelly LeGrand Wiener, and I'm the managing attorney at Scott Legal and also have extensive experience with E-2s. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please go ahead and send them through the chat box. We will either get to them, as we go through, if it's relevant to what we're going through at the time, or we'll also reserve some time at the end of the presentation for questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on demand. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Michaela to get us started. Talking about the E-2 visa requirements.
Thank you, Kelly, and good morning, everyone. So yeah, let's get started with the E-2 visa requirements. So the first requirement for the E-2 visa is that you must be a national of E-2 visa treaty country. So not all countries in the world are E-2 visa treaty countries, but many countries are. So, for example, many countries in Europe, such as the UK, France, Germany, Poland are E-2 visa treaty countries, and other countries around the world, such as Australia, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and many, many others are. But the important thing here is that you want to first check that the country you are a national of is E-2 visa treaty country. And if it is, then you may qualify for an E-2 visa. And another important thing here is that what matters is if you have a passport of the E-2 visa treaty country, you do not have to be born in the E-2 visa treaty country. So let's say, for example, that you were born in India or China. Those are not E-2 visa treaty countries, but then you acquired citizenship, for example, in Canada or Mexico or other E-2 visa treaty country. You may still qualify for an E-2 visa because you are a national of the E-2 visa treaty country. Then the second requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company. So this is a very important requirement, and you must always own at least 50%. So this is, you must own at least 50% at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, but you must keep the ownership the whole time you are in the US on an E-2 visa. And this is a really important thing to keep in mind because some people just think that at the time they are applying for an E-2 visa that they must own 50%, but later there comes an opportunity and they kind of like sell their ownership. But if this happens, they would no longer qualify. So you must kind of like keep at least 50% the whole time you are in the US on an E-2 visa. And it's completely fine if, let's say, at the beginning, you own like 100% or 80%, and then you sell kind of like some shares to someone else, but you must always keep at least 50%. The third requirement is that you must make an investment in the US. So what this means is that the funds, the money you are investing must be at risk. And this means that the money must be actually spent on some expenditures. It is not enough if you just have the money kind of like sitting on your bank account. So let's say that you have 200,000 kind of like sitting on your bank account or kind of like business bank account. That would not be enough to qualify for an E-2 visa. You must actually spend the money to qualify for an E-2 visa, and you must spend the money before we kind of apply for an E-2 visa and before an interview. It's also not enough to kind of say that you have the money on a bank account and you will spend it once you are in the US. The money must be spent before you submit the E-2 petition to the consulate or USCIS. We will also have to explain in the E-2 visa application where the money you are investing comes from. And it can really come from any kind of legitimate source. So it can come from your personal savings, from employment throughout the years. It can come from a gift. It can come from sale of a house. It can come from a loan. We'll just kind of need to explain and submit supporting documents where the money comes from. The next thing about the investment is that the investment for an E-2 visa must be substantial. And we'll kind of, we'll go over this in more detail on one of the next slides. So we'll discuss that in more detail at that point. And some typical E-2 visa expenditures are, for example, inventory. If you will be selling something in the US, any kind of equipment you need to operate the business. Any money you spend on website can be counted as an E-2 visa expenditures. Office supplies, any money you spend on office or warehouse rent can be counted as an E-2 visa expenditures. Any money you spend on marketing or business entity setup, all of these are kind of good E-2 visa expenditures we could include in the E-2 visa application. And then the investment will be obviously kind of different if you are starting the E-2 business versus if you are kind of like purchasing an already operating business. So if you are starting your own business, then the investment would be all those kind of like expenditures I just went through. But if you are purchasing a business, then the investment would be the purchase price you are paying to the seller. And in case you are purchasing a business in the US, there is an option to put the money to an escrow, and this is really many people kind of prefer, if they are purchasing a business, prefer that the money goes to an escrow. Because in that way, if the E-2 visa is not approved, then the money would be kind of like returned back to you and would not go to the seller. But the important thing about the escrow is that kind of like all contingencies to the sale of the business must be kind of satisfied, and the only kind of like contingency left is the approval of the E-2 visa. And so if you put the money to the escrow and put this into the escrow agreement, if the E-2 visa is approved, then the money would go to the seller. But if the E-2 visa is not approved, then the money would go back to you. Then another E-2 visa requirement is that the E-2 business cannot be marginal. And so what this means is that the E-2 company has to have either a present or future capacity to kind of support more than just you and your family. And what this usually means is that you will need to show that the company will be able to hire US employees. And you don't have to hire US employees kind of like immediately in the first year, but ideally by year 5, you would have at least 3 or 4 full-time employees in the US. The next requirement is that the E-2 business must be real and operating. So what this means is that, let's say if the E2 company is kind of already kind of taken revenue from clients, you would submit evidence such as contracts with the clients, or the company's bank statements showing that it's already taken revenue, or the company's profit and loss statement or previous tax returns to just kind of show that the business is already taken revenue from clients. If the business is not yet kind of taken revenue from clients, then you could submit evidence such as signed commercial lease to show that even though you're not taking revenue yet, you have commercial space in place where the business will be operating from. You could also submit evidence that the business entity has been set up, or that the company has created a website. And if you have kind of contracts with customers already, you could submit those. If you do not have contracts, but you have letters of intent from potential clients, you could submit those. Or you could also submit evidence that you obtained all necessary licenses you need to operate the E2 company. And basically, if the company is not taking revenue from clients yet, you want to show that kind of everything is ready, you did and you obtain everything necessary, and the only kind of like step, the only thing left to do is the approval of your E2 visa. And once you come to the US, the business can kind of like start operating immediately. The next requirement is that you will have to develop and direct the E2 company. So if your goal is just to kind of like come to the US and kind of own the business, but not kind of spend your time like managing the business, then the E2 visa is not a best option for you. Because for the E2 visa, we really need to show that you will be kind of actively participating in kind of managing the E2 company. And we would have to show that kind of like the role you will have in the E2 business is executive or managerial, and you will not be kind of doing like the day-to-day everyday tasks. The next requirement is that you must have intent to return to your home country when your E2 visa expires. So here, what is usually sufficient is if we submit a declaration signed by you that basically says that once your E2 visa expires, you have intent to return to your home country. And in most cases, this is really all that is needed. So if you previously applied for a B visa or some different visas, the standard there may be a little bit higher, but for the E2 visa, we really just, in most cases, need to submit this signed declaration by you saying that you do plan to return to your home country. Perfect. So now let's go over who can apply for an E2 visa and how long does the E2 visa last for. So E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US and develop and direct operations of their company. So there are two options how you can get an E2 visa. So you can, as I mentioned previously, you can either purchase an already existing company, or you can start your own company. And this is really, there is, one is not better than the other. It's just really what do you personally prefer. So both options are possible. I would say if you are purchasing an existing business, you want to be careful and you want to kind of like review the company's tax returns and W-2s. Because let's say if you are purchasing a business and the business, the revenue has been kind of like decreasing year by year, and the company, let's say, only has one or two employees, that may not be kind of like the best business to purchase for the purposes of an E-2 visa. Usually we want to show that the revenue is kind of increasing each year, and the company has, as I mentioned previously, at least like 3-4 full-time employees. So I would say if you are purchasing a business, you would want to speak with an experienced E-2 immigration attorney who will help you to kind of like review the financial statements of the business and discuss with you what, you know, if the business you are planning to purchase is a good purchase. So as I mentioned previously, to qualify for an E-2 visa, you must be a national of an E-2 visa treaty countries. And many countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East are E-2 visa treaty countries. And some countries are sometimes, new countries are added to the E-2 visa treaty list. So you want to definitely double check if you qualify. And different countries or nationals of different countries can be granted E-2 visa for different time periods. Some nationals of certain countries can be granted E-2 visa, for example, only for 3 months, but nationals of other countries can be granted E-2 visa for up to 5 years. And how this basically works is that even if you are granted E-2 visa for 3 months, if you enter the US, you will get 2 years in E-2 status. So even if your even if the E-2 visa itself is only valid for 3 months, if you come to the US, you can stay for up to 2 years, but you cannot leave the US. Or if you leave the US and the E-2 visa is already expired, then you would need a new visa. And if your E-2 visa is valid for 5 years, then you can kind of re-enter multiple times, and each time you can stay for up to 2 years. Perfect. So now let's discuss how much investment is enough for the E-2 visa. So the E-2 investment must be substantial, and there is no kind of like minimum investment amount in the regulation. And so the government, the consulate, they don't specify like how much minimum invested they want to see. And so it really depends, the amount you have to invest really depends on what type of business you are starting. So let's say if you're starting a consulting company, for example, you will obviously you will be investing less amount than if you were, for example, starting like a restaurant or like a car manufacturing factory. And that is because if you're starting a consulting business, you can rent an office space, you can buy computer, you can set up a website, spend some money on marketing, but that is already kind of like needed to kind of start that kind of business. On the other hand, let's say you are starting a restaurant. In that case, you would need to kind of like purchase the kitchen equipment, furniture. So the investment amount in that case would be much higher. So really, how much money you have to invest will depend on what type of business you plan to start. And what the government uses is so-called proportionality test. And they basically look at how much money you invested in the business and what are the usual costs associated with establishing that type of business. So and the government wants to see evidence that you invested 100% or close to 100%. So here we often submit evidence such as business articles that discuss that, for example, for this type of consulting business, let's say 50,000 is all that is needed to start kind of like this type of consulting business. And if you invested, 45, 50, or 60,000, then we would make the argument that the money you invested is substantial. And another type of evidence we sometimes submit is a letter from a certified public accountant, and the CPA would basically look at the expenditures you made and would conclude in the letter whether he or she thinks that you kind of invested everything what is needed to establish this type of business. And if the CPA concludes that you did, then we would submit the letter from the CPA to make an argument that the investment, that your E2 investment is substantial. And the proportionality test, in case you are purchasing a business, works that in a way that the government basically looks at the purchase price, the price you paid to buy the business, and they look at the fair market value of the business. And if the price is the same or almost the same, then you know, the conclusion would be that that the E2 investment is substantial, and that you invested all that is needed to you know, to kind of like get the E2 business. Perfect. So what are some strategies to deal with a low investment amount? So let's say that your investment amount is, you know, let's say that you are starting a consulting business, and your investment amount is around $40,000, and you already kind of like paid for a rent, you already purchased all the equipment you need, all the office supplies you need, all the kind of softwares you need, you already kind of like spend all the money you had to kind of like get the business running, but the investment amount is still only around $35,000. So what can we do to strengthen the E2 application? So in this case, we usually recommend that in case the E2 investment amount is low, we recommend that the other aspects of the E2 application are strong. So one aspect of the E2 application that we usually kind of recommend to strengthen is the real and operating section. So here we would want to submit evidence that you already have contracts signed with clients, or that you have letters of intent, meaning that these are letters from potential clients that basically say that they intend to conduct business with you, and once you get the visa, they will, but they are not legally binding as contracts are, but the letters of intent are still very helpful for an E2 visa application. Then we could also submit a letter from a local organization, such as a local chamber of commerce, and then and these letters usually basically say that the business you are kind of establishing will be helpful for a local economy, and will employ local employees, so is good addition to the local economy. So we could submit those. And in case your business is already taking revenue, we could submit the company's bank statements showing that you are already taking revenue. And the other kind of like aspect of E2 application we usually recommend to strengthen is the marginality section. So here, if you are able to hire employees, that will be really helpful for the E2 application. If you are not able to hire US employees, then we would need to submit kind of strong business plan that outlines how many employees and in what year and on what positions you plan to hire. So let's look at these two examples. So in example one, you are opening a business and the investment amount is low, but you already hired 2 US employees and the business already started taking revenue around $80,000 per month, and you already have around 10 clients. So I would say that in this case, even the investment amount is very low, the E2 petition would be most likely approved just because you already hired US employees, the company is already successfully operating, you already have 10 clients. So I would say in this case, the E2 visa would be most likely approved. And in the second example, you are applying for an E-2 visa and the investment amount is low, but you don't want to invest any more money and you don't want to hire anyone until after the E-2 visa is approved and you come to the US. So the second example is obviously much kind of weaker than the first one. And in this case, we would definitely kind of recommend to either spend some additional money or at least hire some employees or submit kind of some evidence from for the real and operating section, as I explained before. Perfect. So what are some common E-2 visa expenditures in case you are starting your own business and you kind of want to spend the money? Clients often ask us, you know, like what should they spend money on, and what are some good and versus bad E-2 visa expenditures. So some typical E-2 visa expenditures are, for example, website setup. So any money you pay for the kind of like website development or website maintenance kind of each month, you know, those we could include those. We could include any money you spend on computers, printers, scanners, kind of like any computer equipment you need to kind of like operate the business. Any money you spend on inventory in case you will be selling some products in the US. Any money you spend on furniture to kind of furnish the commercial space. Any money you spend on trademark or intellectual property can be included as an E2 expenditures. If you already have employees, then you could include the money you are paying to the employees as part of the E2 visa investment. Any money you spend on legal fees or business entity setup fees, those could be included as part of the E2 visa investment. And then any money you spend on office supplies, training courses. Usually the training courses would be training courses like you took online for yourself or your employees kind of took to educate themselves. Then any money you spend on licensing fees could be included as part of the E2 visa investment. In case you are kind of purchasing a real estate property to kind of open your business there, those could be included. And then any money you spend on, for example, software or advertising, all of those could be included as part of the E2 visa investment. So all of these are kind of good and strong E2 visa expenditures. And now let's look at some bad or better said, like weak E2 visa expenditures we usually do not recommend to include. So those are, for example, flights. So, you know, for example, if you are flying somewhere in the US to meet with clients or potential clients, the flights we don't usually recommend to include those, just because they are the consulates, they view them as weak E2 expenditures because they are not necessarily kind of connected to you know, to kind of like starting the E2 business. Any money you spend on travel accommodation such as hotels or transportation such as taxis, Ubers, we don't usually recommend to include those because again they are considered to be weak. And any money you spend on meals, entertainment, we don't usually recommend to include those. Additionally, kind of like any expenses that are directly reimbursed by a client or customers, those are also viewed as weak E2 visa expenditures. And any expenses that are paid to related parties, those are again we don't usually recommend to include those because they are viewed to be weak E2 visa expenditures. Perfect. So now Kelly will go over some common challenges and tips for E2 consulting businesses.
Thank you, Michaela. Now that was a great background in the E-2 visa, and some of the, great expenditures you can make, as well as ones we don't recommend including. So when we look at common challenges, for consulting businesses, theoretically, you could have a very low investment to start your consulting business. And I'd say it's extremely common that we hear from clients, how can I get this visa? Because I don't need to make any investment. I can start my company with a computer I already own in my home office, and there's just nothing I can spend money on. So ultimately, we have many clients in this situation who are able to successfully get the visa with one of these lower investment amounts we've been talking about. So when we say that, we really mean investments kind of under the $200,000 or $150,000 mark. And then really low investments that are kind of under 100,000, which, can work. And we processed many of them, but really tend to work only at certain consulates. So when you're thinking about this, for a consulting business, you really want to think, okay, yes, although you could start your business in a home office, spending no money with just your computer, ultimately this is an investor visa and you will need to invest money to get the visa. So we encourage clients to invest in things that will be useful for them, in the long run. So for example, let's say, you have an initial pipeline of clients, so you weren't planning to have a really sophisticated website, but you would plan to have that down the line. Perhaps you invest a bit more money up front to get that professional website done now. Similarly, if you're going to hire an employee, in the next 6 months, perhaps you hire the employer earlier, because anything that you pay, both, in terms of employee payments and to kind of get the employee set up. So if you have a payroll company, if you have to purchase equipment, for that employee, any kind of computers or printers or things like that, all of those are really strong E2 expenditures. Similarly, like if there are software services, perhaps that would be, help you with your business, or maybe a marketing campaign, that you were going to hold off for a couple of years, it can be helpful to just spend that money now. Ultimately, it will still, be valuable to your business, but it helps you to get the E2 investor visa, which is, the ultimate goal that allows you to come to the US and actually run the business. So, those are kind of some tips we have for how do you get that investment amount up to where you need it to be to actually qualify for the visa, although the startup costs for a consulting business are very low. So you always want to be thinking about what would the consular officer be thinking when they look at this business, because one concern for consulting businesses is that the person is coming to the US just to act as a solo consultant. And that is not what the E2 visa is for. The E2 visa is meant to, in order to not be a marginal business, the business does need to intend to, support more than just the investor and their family. So the person does need to plan to hire US workers. The person does need to plan to actually develop and direct the business at a high level, as opposed to just coming in and acting as a solo consultant would. So that's something that you need to, when you're putting together the application, you have to think that the officer is kind of aware that some people may be wanting to do that. And you need to be thinking, how can I, make it clear to the officer that I don't intend to do that I do intend to hire US workers, that I do intend to have a more broad-based business that I'm going to develop and direct into an enterprise that is not marginal. So, we already talked a little bit about some common E2 expenditures, that Michaela mentioned, things that are also very, very good for consulting businesses. For office space, sometimes you can prepay, 6 to 12 months of your lease. In that situation, you may even be able to get the landlord to add a provision that states that if you don't get the visa, you'll get some of that deposit back or some of that prepayment back. So that can be a way to kind of commit some funds, but also help protect yourself. Equipment is another great expense, and something, maybe, it's time to kind of upgrade to a new computer. Maybe you need to get yourself some office equipment. You need to get your employees some office equipment. Investments in marketing are great for consultants. I think they always really want to see, do you have contracts in place? Do you have letters of intent? And if you don't, particularly, it's going to be very important to show you have a strong marketing campaign to show how you're going to stand out from kind of all the other consulting businesses out there. And then hiring employees as well, is kind of a twofold, assistance with the application, because it shows that the business is not marginal if you're already able to pay an employee. And then additionally, it helps bolster your investment amount, because anything that you pay for your employees or to get anything set up for your employees, is a very strong E-2 expense. So let's also talk about kind of challenges for real estate investments. The really big challenge with these types of cases is that USCIS and the consulates are generally going to scrutinize you more closely to ensure that it's, that your business is really an active company and not just passive real estate ownership. It's even kind of mentioned on some consulates' websites that it does not, it doesn't qualify you for the E-2 to just purchase a home in the United States and have kind of that property ownership itself be any type of active E-2 enterprise. So purchasing a property, putting it in the name of an LLC, this alone is not going to qualify, for an E-2. So like flipping homes as well is really not looked upon favorably. Another thing that's become popular is kind of the management of Airbnb properties. So for both flipping homes and kind of the management of Airbnb properties, you want to think about scale. So if you're flipping, for example, we had a client who, was flipping about 30 to 40 homes. So this was on a very large scale that they were doing this business or commercial real estate development, or somebody who is managing an apartment building that has, 200 units in it. So those are the types of things that you're looking at, owning one property, flipping one or two houses, even if they are high dollar value, managing a couple Airbnb properties. Those are generally not going to rise to the level to convince the officers that this is really an active business that would qualify for the E-2. Things that have worked, for E-2 kind of real estate companies. So brokerage firms, management companies, renovation or construction, house flipping on a large scale. If you have one of these types of real estate businesses, and let's say you're doing property management of multiple properties and you have proof of that, and then you also on the side want to be able to flip homes as part of your business structure, you can do that. You can add that into your business plan. However, if it's going to be the main activity you're undertaking, it really needs to be happening on a very large scale where, usually kind of millions of dollars are going to be your investment, as opposed to these lower investment amounts that we've been talking about. Another thing with real estate is you want to make sure you have the proper licenses. It's a very regulated industry. In the US, it's often regulated state by state. So you really need to look into what is required to do each of these types of activities you want to do and make sure you have those licenses. So I think that's always a really important thing to keep in mind. Another common area, that people come to us about are kind of E-2 visas for equity trading companies. And this has some similar challenges to real estate in the sense that you need to convince the consulate or USCIS that this is an active business and you're not just engaging in kind of personal trading or trading for a few family and friends. So again, placing your stock portfolio in the name of an LLC isn't going to qualify. If you have kind of letters of intent from clients, which is very important with this type of business, it really should go beyond kind of your friends and family. And you should have a strong marketing plan to explain how you're going to solicit additional clients into your business, and to show that you're going to hire workers. Also similar to real estate, it's a highly regulated industry. So you need to make sure that you have all of your licenses in place. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. One reason could be low investment amount. If you're in a situation where perhaps you've invested maybe $100,000 and you've spent maybe $40,000, let's say you're denied on low investment amount, but you have kind of a service-based business with, an arguably lower startup amount. In that case, you may want to just spend some of that working capital that you have. That can be an easy way to kind of, bolster the application, get yourself into a position where you can kind of go back and say, okay, well, I've spent some additional money, in these various, areas, please approve the petition. So that one, if you have more money to invest, can be a relatively easy one to meet. There are some consulates that just kind of take a particular position about, investment amounts, particularly consulates that are used to seeing kind of companies come and register E-2 companies. So maybe they have very large investment amounts, millions of dollars. If you're then coming to them, with an investment amount of $100,000 or lower, it's going to be an uphill battle, to explain kind of that you have, invested everything to be substantial. Other things you can do besides investing more money, you can get, perhaps have a CPA look at your business plan and your investment schedule and, issue an opinion that this is substantial for this type of business. This is most effective when you can get a CPA who has experience in your industry working with kind of small and mid-sized businesses. So I think those additionally, if you can get industry or market reports, sometimes, there are kind of respected business publications or magazines that will talk about what the startup costs are for a particular type of business. If you can include those as well, those are also helpful to show that even though the investment amount is low, it's still substantial in light of the type of business that you're starting. Another reason for denials can be kind of the nature of the business. So that, the businesses that we just talked about, consulting, real estate, equity companies, while we've had approvals for all those types of businesses, you do go in knowing that these are going to be kind of riskier businesses, and you want to kind of think about what is the consular officer concerned about. So if they see real estate, they're immediately going to be concerned, is this active enough? Is it house flipping? And you want to address those concerns proactively in your application. Another, reason can just be filing location or venue. So, as I mentioned, certain places are more friendly to lower investment amounts and some are really not. So, when you file within the country with USCIS, they tend to be more friendly towards lower investment amounts. Toronto as well, I think, takes a reasonable approach. Even London, who kind of does prefer the higher investment amounts, still, I think, has a very experienced E-2 visa unit. So will take a more reasonable approach when looking holistically at the file. But there are some places where a lower investment amount is just, going to be an uphill battle. For example, Argentina sometimes can, take a hard line on that. Japan as well is an area where a consulate where they're often seeing much higher investment amounts from larger companies. That's not to say you cannot get a lower investment amount approved there. We certainly have, around the 100,000 or over mark. It's just that going into it that, there's the potential that they just reject it because of the amount. Other reasons, if you have a business in your home country that you've run for many, many years without any employees, you've never hired employees, that can be a red flag. Now when you go to the consulate, if you're just relying on the strength of your business plan, they may look at that and say, okay, yes, you have a business plan, but you've run the same company for 10 years and you've never hired employees. So for that type of thing, ahead of time, you may want to hire an employee before you file, just to head off, that concern. The other, related to this is this concern over whether the business is going to create jobs for U.S. workers. So, as a consultant, if you're coming in with a consulting company, they're going to be concerned. Am I just coming in as a solo consultant? Ultimately, again, hiring employees before you file is a good, way to go. Also, just having a very strong and realistic business plan that explains, exactly how you're going to build your workforce. Additionally, sometimes there are just issues with the adjudicating officer. You may get an officer that either doesn't understand the requirements, or an officer that just is taking a particular position about your case or is unhappy that day. One thing is that if you are kind of, denied and then you decide you want to reapply, very often the consulates will make an effort to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but it is something that most consulates do try to do. Another, maybe you just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So, if your ownership structure wasn't set up properly to show that, treaty country nationals owned, 50% of the company, or perhaps let's say you just put $100,000 in a business bank account and didn't spend any of it. You just do not meet the requirements at that point because you haven't put any money at risk. So, that's something that you want to work with your attorney to kind of remedy in any new application. So now let's turn to talk a bit about, adjudication trends and hot topics. So, one thing that unfortunately has continued to be, a hot topic around all visa processing, including E-2s, is just the ongoing impacts of the global pandemic. So, there are continual E-2 processing delays that are directly tied to impacts of the pandemic. Unfortunately, at U.S. consulates kind of around the world, there were really significant impacts on staffing. Many officers retired or left. There are now new classes of foreign service officers that are being trained. However, the E-2 visa is a very, it's a complex visa. And so not every single officer, who knows maybe, can be doing B visas or something kind of a bit less complicated can do these visas. And while there are some consulates with very sophisticated E-2 visa units where you have many officers, that work on these types of visas, there are some consulates that are just smaller and have not recovered yet. So there are some consulates like, Colombia, for example, where they are actually just not processing E-2 visas at all still, where as in other consulates, for example, in London, they're not back to where they were in terms of appointment availability, but in terms of accepting visas and getting in touch within about 45 business days, they're kind of back to a much more normal schedule. So it really is still kind of all over the map. And something that you want to kind of discuss with your immigration attorney as to where should I file, what's the best option for me, because it is the consulates just vary widely in how much they've recovered in the past couple of years. So our consulates currently processing E-2s, many of them are, some are not. In terms of timelines, it's really all over the place. Even the consulates that have kind of gotten back to reviewing the files within maybe a couple of weeks or a month or two, appointment availability can still then be several months out from that because they're also dealing with backlogs in all the other areas in which consulates serve the public. So one thing to consider is if you are in a situation where you're either in the US on another type of non-immigrant visa, not ESTA, but some other visa that allows you to change status, or you're already here on an E-2, and the timelines are really long, one thing you can consider is either changing your status or extending your status with USCIS. When we look at the differences between USCIS and the consulate, USCIS, if you change or extend your status, what you get is an approval to stay in the United States for 2 years and run the company. You do not get the ability to travel internationally, and everybody gets the same 2 years. So even if you're, from one of those countries that's eligible for a 5-year visa, you wouldn't get 5 years. Everybody gets 2 years. Another issue with USCIS can be if you're doing a change of status, they will be really, really picky about the source and trail of funds. At consulates, they tend to take a much more high-level view, holistically. If you say the source of funds was from your personal savings, they'll look at your tax returns, they'll look at your bank statement showing the transfer to the E-2 company. Whereas with USCIS, they're much more likely to really dig in and say, okay, well, send me the bank statements over the several years, proving that you had accumulated that money. And then, explain the various kind of transfers of money to me. So they're very kind of, they take a very, very close look at exactly where the money came from. So if you have a more complicated source or trail of funds, going through USCIS, may not be the way that you want to go. Prior to the pandemic, I'd say we pretty much always recommended to our clients that they go to the consulate. The benefit of the consulate for most people is you can get, a 4 or 5 year visa. While there are those countries that have the 3-month reciprocity period, there's many countries that have reciprocity periods of years. So you have that, you're able to get that 5-year visa, and then you can travel in and out of the US freely for 5 years. Additionally, the consulates tend not to be as strict on the source and trail of funds. And if you file with USCIS and you get that 2-year extension, and then you travel and you go to the consulate with your application, you're submitting a brand new application to the consulate. They do not have to rely on the USCIS approval at all. So, if your consulate is one of those that is processing E-2 visas regularly and the reciprocity period is a few years, filing with the consulate may be, a better option for you. So finally, just some issues and complex areas that come up. So I have to hire employees before I apply? So the answer is no. I'd say the majority of our clients, do not hire employees before they apply for an E-2 visa. That being said, in these types of risky cases we've talked about today, it can be very advantageous to your case if you are able to hire someone, even if it's perhaps a part-time office manager who's going to be doing some of the setup admin for you in the United States. It can just be a very, beneficial step in terms of, showing that the business is not marginal and bolstering that investment amount. One thing to consider is that if you're in the US, like let's say you were here on a B2 tourist visa or even a B1 business visitor visa, you want to be careful about kind of hiring and managing a low-level employee while you're physically here, but not on a work visa. So that's just something to keep in mind. It can still be beneficial to hire someone, but you want to make sure that it's very clear that you are not engaging in any work activities until you get your E-2 approval. Other things that come up are kind of complicated sources and trail of funds. This is really mostly an issue for USCIS filings, where they will want to see kind of every single step of the money. So let's say that you got the money from a trust, and the money in the trust came from a sale of property. Like USCIS may want you to go back all that way to see what was the actual source of that money to prove that it was legitimate. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about how do I want to structure my investment. If I have multiple options, you want to speak with the attorney first just to make sure that you're not structuring it in such a way that it won't work for the visa. So for example, you can take out a loan. Let's say you own a property and you want to take out a home equity loan on your property, that can be a great source of funds. However, if you are trying to take out a loan and the security for the loan are the assets of the E-2 business. So for example, like you're buying some land or a company and you're doing some type of seller financing, that does not work for the E-2. It's very explicit that although you can use a loan, the security cannot be the assets of the E-2 business, because then, the funds are not really at risk in the way that they require for the visa. Gifts are permitted for the E-2 visa and can be a great source of investment, but a gift letter alone is not enough. You will need to explain, the gift giver, where did they get that money, and provide documentation. So you need to kind of speak to the gift giver ahead of time to make sure they're going to be willing to provide you with those financial documents. E-2 visas, for two investors, this is something that can work. The ownership does need to be 50-50 if you both want to be investors, and you need to both be able to kind of equally control the company. Additionally, when you are doing E-2 visas for two investors, both people need to invest money, and one person cannot let's say one person has $100,000 and they want to own the business with their friend, they cannot gift 50,000 of their own money to that friend, because it's really not going to be considered the friend's personal investment if the other person is also an owner of the company. So when you have two owners, you don't want to have that, that type of source of funds. Other things that come up are substantive changes to the E-2 business after filing. So, sometimes people start a company and they have the goal of kind of selling equity in their company over time. Changes in ownership are okay as long as your ownership doesn't fall below 50%, your ownership and control. And if you're an E-2 employee, it's okay if your ownership is under 50% or even nothing, but the ownership of the company needs to be at least 50% owned by treaty country nationals. And if that goes away, or let's say when you have an owner and they, become a green card holder, they no longer qualify for purposes of figuring out treaty country nationality. So any changes in ownership prior to them happening, you want to discuss with your immigration attorney, because even if you have a 5-year visa, if at year 2.5, your ownership goes down to 20%, that visa is technically no longer valid because you don't actually meet the requirements anymore. Similarly, changes in type of business. If the change is a natural outgrowth of the type of business you're doing, let's say you're a wedding photographer, now you want to start kind of a wedding, a wedding blog that also kind of talks about different vendors or different kind of products for weddings. That's really, pretty related to kind of what you were doing. So likely starting something like that is just going to be seen as the business kind of expanding its services as opposed to changing, versus if you you're a wedding photographer and now you want to open a restaurant. That's a completely different type of business. So for that, you would actually need to get an approval, from the government, either from the consulate or USCIS before you start. So it's not going to be okay to stop your wedding photography business, purchase your restaurant, and then submit a new application. You actually need, you can't start running that restaurant until you get that approval. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of maintaining your status. And then, finally, family business purchases. This is very common. If you are going to purchase a business from a family member, we recommend that you get some type of third-party valuation or perhaps a letter from the accountant or CPA. And the money that you're paying should make sense in light of the financials of the business, which should be disclosed. So you're just going to get a bit more scrutiny with these types of cases. Normally, when you're purchasing a business, kind of just on the open market, if it's being sold for $100,000 and you purchase it for $100,000, that's going to be considered substantial because that was the fair market value that it was being sold for, just on the open market. Versus if you're buying it from somebody that that's a family member, you really need to do a bit more to make them feel confident, that the amount that you're paying is really the fair market value for the business and should be considered substantial. All right, so we are now at the end of the presentation, and I think we have not had any questions come in. If anyone has any, feel free to write in now. So if not, then I think we will close. Thank you so much, Michaela, for your, your contributions and, and sharing all the information with us. Let's see, someone wrote in here, I'm a fresh graduate and like to start a company that provides services to companies that need my skills in art. Can I apply while I'm still in the US? I'm weighing that option versus working for a company full time. New graduates can sometimes get E-2 visas. In terms of the viability of the application as a whole, it really is going to depend on, I'd suggest kind of setting up a consult with us. You can go to our website and set up a consultation. Yes, you can apply while you're in the United States. You can either, while you're here, if you're on a valid F1 visa or on OPT, you can apply at the consulate or apply through USCIS. Again, which one you choose will really depend on your particular situation. You also mentioned doing freelance jobs while studying. If you're doing that, you just want to make sure that's in the parameters of what's permitted on the F1. Otherwise, changing status with USCIS is not a good option because you have to be maintaining status in order to, to change status. All right, so thank you so much, everyone. And we hope you have a wonderful Wednesday. And thank you very much.